Sometimes the most broken souls find each other when hope seems lost forever. In the quiet town of Dry Creek, that truth came walking down Main Street on 4 paws and a limp. Sheriff Eli Barnes had been missing for 3 days when a battle-scarred German shepherd appeared, carrying the lawman's silver star in his mouth. The dog had tracked Eli through 20 miles of desert to an old sawmill where outlaws left him for dead. When the townspeople followed the shepherd back through the canyon, they found their sheriff barely alive. But what happened after Eli healed brought the whole town to tears. The sheriff pinned his own badge on that dog's collar and made him his deputy. For the first time in years, Dry Creek had found its heart again through the bond between a broken lawman and a stray dog who refused to give up. This is the story of how loyalty and courage can heal even the deepest wounds. But why did seeing that badge on the dog's collar make every person in town weep? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered buildings of Dry Creek, painting the dusty streets in shades of gold and amber. Sheriff Eli Barnes stood on the wooden porch of his office, surveying the town that had become both his responsibility and his burden. At 53, his weathered face bore the lines of a man who had seen too much and carried the weight of others' expectations on his shoulders like an invisible yoke. The silver star pinned to his vest caught the early light, the same badge his father had worn as a Texas Ranger for 27 years before a bullet found him in a canyon not unlike the ones surrounding Dry Creek. Eli's fingers traced the worn edges of the metal, feeling the scratches and dents that told stories of justice served and evil confronted. Inside his vest pocket, wrapped in soft leather, lay his father's original Ranger badge, a constant reminder of the legacy he struggled to honor. Dry Creek had been dying a slow death for the better part of 5 years. The cattle ranchers who once brought prosperity to the town found their herds mysteriously shrinking, stolen in the night by rustlers who seemed to know every trail and hiding place in the vast canyon country. 3 sheriffs before Eli had tried to stop the thievery. 2 had simply disappeared without a trace, their bodies never found among the countless gulches and rocky outcroppings. The 3rd had been found shot through the back, his horse wandering into town with an empty saddle and blood on the leather. When Eli had taken the position 8 months ago, the town council had been desperate enough to hire anyone willing to pin on the badge. He'd come to Dry Creek carrying nothing but his father's reputation, a well-worn Colt revolver, and a determination to prove that the Barnes name still meant something in the territory. The townspeople had welcomed him with a mixture of hope and resignation. Hope that maybe this time would be different. Resignation born from too many disappointments. Doc Henley emerged from his clinic across the street, his medical bag in hand, and concern etched across his lined face. At 68, he'd been the town's physician for more than 30 years, delivering babies who had grown into adults and tending wounds that told the harsh story of frontier life. His white hair caught the morning breeze as he approached Eli's porch. "Morning, Sheriff," Doc said, settling his considerable frame onto the wooden steps. "Sleep any better last night?" Eli shook his head, his eyes still scanning the horizon. "Can't seem to quiet the mind lately. Something feels different out there, Doc. The rustling's getting bolder, more organized. This isn't just a few drifters looking to make quick money. You thinking it's the same bunch that got Sheriff Morrison? I'm thinking it's worse than that." Eli pulled out a telegram that had arrived the previous evening. "Got word from the territorial marshal yesterday. Similar cattle thefts reported in 3 counties south of here, all following the same pattern. Professional operation. Someone who knows the land and the business." Doc Henley studied the telegram, his medical training making him naturally analytical. "What's your plan?" Before Eli could answer, Mayor Caldwell's carriage rounded the corner, dust swirling behind the wheels. The mayor was a portly man in his 50s who'd built his fortune running the general store before politics called to him. His face, usually flushed from either exertion or whiskey, looked particularly red this morning. "Sheriff Barnes," he called out, not bothering to wait until his carriage stopped. "We need to talk. Lost another dozen head at the Johnson Ranch last night. That's the third raid this month." Eli descended the porch steps, his hand instinctively checking the position of his holstered weapon. "Any witnesses this time?" Young Tommy Johnson saw riders heading north toward the canyon country around midnight. "Same direction as always." Mayor Caldwell mopped his forehead with a handkerchief, despite the cool morning air. "Folks are getting scared, Sheriff. Real scared. Some are talking about packing up and heading back east. Can't say I blame them," Doc Henley muttered, earning a sharp look from the mayor. "Now see here." "Doc, no, he's right," Eli interrupted. "People have a right to be scared. But running won't solve the problem. These rustlers will just move on to the next town, the next county. Someone has to make a stand." From across the street, Martha Kellison stepped out of her saloon, the Dusty Rose, and walked toward the gathering. At 45, she was a handsome woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd run the saloon since her husband died, in a mining accident 7 years earlier, and had become something of an unofficial town mother to the rougher elements that drifted through Dry Creek. "Morning, gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to maintaining order in a room full of armed men. "Couldn't help but overhear. The Johnson Ranch again." Mayor Caldwell nodded grimly. "The third time in a month. At this rate, there won't be a herd left in the county by Christmas." Martha's expression darkened. "Had a couple of strangers in the saloon last week. Quiet types, kept to themselves mostly, but they were asking an awful lot of questions about local ranches. Where the herds grazed, which trails the cowboys used for moving cattle." Eli's attention sharpened. "Can you describe them?" "One was tall, thin, with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. The other was shorter, stocky, with hands that looked like they'd never done an honest day's work in his life. Both carried their guns low and tied down. Professional gunmen if I ever saw them. Why didn't you mention this before?" Mayor Caldwell demanded. Martha's eyes flashed. "Because strangers ask questions in saloons every day, Mayor. It's only suspicious now because we know what we know." Doc Henley stood up slowly, his joints protesting the movement. "Sheriff, you thinking of riding out to investigate?" Eli nodded, already planning his route. "Going to start at the Johnson Ranch, follow the trail while it's still fresh. Maybe get lucky and find where they're holding the stolen cattle." "You going alone?" Martha asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Easier to track quietly with just one horse. "Besides, if these rustlers are as professional as they seem, I don't want to put anyone else at risk." As if summoned by the conversation, a movement at the edge of town caught Eli's attention. A large dog, a German shepherd by the looks of it, stood at the corner of the last building, watching their gathering with intelligent eyes. The animal was clearly wild, its coat matted and scarred, but something in its bearing suggested a dignity that poverty and hardship hadn't broken. "That dog's been hanging around for the better part of a week," Doc Henley observed, following Eli's gaze. "Skittish as anything, won't let anyone get close. Looks like he's seen some hard times. Probably belonged to one of the ranchers who got hit," Martha said sadly. "Seen it before. Family gets scared, packs up quick, leaves the animals behind." Eli studied the dog for a long moment. There was something in the animal's posture, the way it held itself apart but watchful, that reminded him of his own position in the town. Useful, protective, but ultimately alone. The German shepherd maintained its distance, but didn't flee when Eli looked directly at it. Instead, the dog seemed to be evaluating him, making some kind of judgment about his character and intentions. Its ears were pricked forward in an attitude of alert attention, and its intelligent brown eyes held a depth that suggested experiences beyond what most domestic animals ever faced. "Well," Eli said, turning back to the group, "won't solve anything standing here talking about it. I'll head out to the Johnson place after I get my gear together." Mayor Caldwell grabbed Eli's arm as he started toward his office. "Sheriff, be careful out there. We can't afford to lose another lawman. Don't intend to be lost." "Mayor," as the group dispersed, each returning to their daily responsibilities, Eli noticed the German shepherd had moved closer, now standing near the water trough in front of the general store. The dog's ears were pricked forward, alert and attentive, as if listening to conversations it couldn't quite understand, but knew were important. Eli spent the next hour checking his equipment: ammunition, water, rope, and the small leather journal where he recorded observations and evidence. His father had taught him that good law enforcement was 90% careful observation and 10% quick action. The journal contained detailed notes about each rustling incident, patterns he'd begun to notice, and questions that needed answers. The patterns were troubling. The rustlers always struck during new moon periods when darkness provided maximum cover. They targeted specific ranches in a logical sequence that suggested intimate knowledge of the local geography and cattle operations. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to know exactly when ranchers would be away from their properties and when the most valuable livestock would be grazing in the most vulnerable locations. As he saddled his horse, a bay gelding named Chester that had served him faithfully for 6 years, Eli found himself thinking about the dog again. There had been something familiar in its eyes, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits who understood what it meant to be responsible for the safety of others while standing fundamentally alone. Chester nickered softly as Eli tightened the cinch, the horse sensing the tension that always preceded a potentially dangerous mission. The gelding had carried Eli through more tight spots than either of them cared to remember, and the animal's calm disposition had saved his life more than once when quick thinking and steady nerves were the difference between living and dying. The ride to the Johnson Ranch took 40 minutes, through country that grew increasingly wild and broken as it approached the canyonlands. Red rock formations jutted from the earth like ancient monuments, and the sparse vegetation spoke of a land that demanded respect from those who tried to make a living from it. Sagebrush and desert grass dotted the landscape, interrupted by stands of juniper and pinon pine that provided meager shade in the growing heat of the day. At the ranch, young Tommy Johnson met Eli at the gate, his face bearing the premature gravity of a boy forced to become a man too quickly. At 18, Tommy was trying to fill his father's boots after a riding accident had left the older man partially crippled and unable to handle the physical demands of ranching. "Sheriff, thank God you're here," Tommy said, his voice tight with worry. "They took the best of our breeding stock this time." Those cattle represented 3 years of careful selection and improvement. Eli dismounted and examined the corral where the stolen animals had been kept. The rustlers had cut the fence in 2 places, creating an opening wide enough to drive cattle through without causing a stampede or excessive noise. The cuts were clean and purposeful, made by someone who understood both cattle and fence construction. "Came in quiet-like," Tommy explained, his voice still carrying the excitement of someone who'd witnessed something significant. Knew exactly which animals to take, the best breeding stock, the fattest steers. Wasn't random at all. They'd obviously been watching us, learning our routines. Eli examined the tracks in the soft earth around the corral, noting the professional way the thieves had moved the cattle to minimize noise and disturbance. The hoofprints led north toward a series of canyons that honeycombed the landscape for miles. It was perfect country for hiding stolen livestock, dozens of box canyons and hidden valleys where a herd could graze unseen for weeks. "They knew what they were doing," Eli murmured, following the trail on foot for several hundred yards. "This level of organization means they've been planning these raids for months, maybe longer." The trail was clear enough to follow, but Eli knew from experience that it would soon divide and subdivide as the rustlers used the complex terrain to confuse pursuit. He'd followed similar trails before, only to find himself at dead ends or led in circles through country that looked identical in every direction. "Tommy," he said, returning to where the young rancher waited anxiously, "I need you to think carefully. Has anyone been asking questions about your operation lately? Strangers wanting to know about your cattle, your routines, when you move herds from one pasture to another?" Tommy's face scrunched up in concentration. "Well, there was that fellow who came by about 2 weeks ago. Said he was looking to buy cattle for a ranch down in New Mexico. Asked a lot of questions about our breeding program, when we planned to sell, stuff like that. Can you describe him? Tall, thin, well-dressed for someone claiming to be a cattle buyer. Had a scar along his jaw that looked like it came from a knife fight. Spoke educated-like, but there was something about his eyes that made me nervous. Eli felt a chill of recognition. The description matched Martha's account of one of the strangers who'd been asking questions in the saloon. The rustlers weren't just stealing cattle. They were conducting systematic intelligence gathering to identify the most profitable targets and the best methods for reaching them. By mid-afternoon, Eli had followed the trail deep into the canyon country, where the walls rose on either side like red curtains, and the sky became a narrow ribbon of blue overhead. The tracks led steadily north and east, toward a section of territory that Eli knew only by reputation, a maze of interconnected canyons where even experienced riders could become hopelessly lost. Chester picked his way carefully along the rocky trail, his hooves occasionally skittering on loose stone as they navigated narrow ledges and steep descents. The deeper they penetrated into the canyon system, the more isolated and vulnerable Eli felt. This was perfect ambush country, where a single rifleman could control an entire trail from a concealed position. The walls of the canyon showed layers of geological history stretching back millions of years, bands of red and white and yellow stone that told the story of ancient seas and shifting climates. In some places, the walls were smooth as polished marble, worn by wind and water into flowing curves that seemed almost alive. In others, they were rough and broken, offering countless hiding places for both men and animals. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and purple, Eli found himself at a fork in the trail. The cattle tracks split here, some heading deeper into the mountains, others curving back toward the south. It was a deliberate decision by the rustlers, a way to confuse any pursuit and make recovery of the stolen animals nearly impossible. Eli dismounted and studied the ground carefully, trying to determine which trail showed more recent use. The art of tracking had been one of his father's specialties, and Eli had spent countless hours as a boy learning to read sign in dirt and stone and grass. But the rustlers were clearly experienced at covering their tracks, and the rocky ground made distinguishing between fresh and old sign nearly impossible. He was crouched beside a patch of soft earth, examining what might have been a fresh hoofprint, when Chester suddenly lifted his head and snorted in alarm. The gelding's ears were pricked forward, focused on something Eli couldn't see or hear. Years of partnership had taught him to trust his horse's superior senses, and he rose quickly, his hand moving instinctively to his holstered weapon. The sound of approaching horses reached his ears a moment later, multiple riders, moving fast but trying to stay quiet. Eli led Chester quickly into a narrow side canyon, hoping to avoid detection while he assessed the threat. But as he rounded a bend in the rocky passage, he realized he'd made a tactical error. The side canyon was a dead end, a box with only one way in or out. 3 men emerged from behind a rocky outcropping, their guns already drawn and pointed in his direction. Eli recognized the tall one with the scar from Tommy Johnson's description, and his heart sank as he realized he'd ridden directly into a carefully planned ambush. Well, the scarred man said, his voice carrying a soft accent that suggested education and breeding. Sheriff Eli Barnes, I presume. We've been expecting you. Eli kept his hands visible but ready, his mind racing through options that all seemed to end badly. You seem to know me, but I don't believe we've been introduced. Name's Garrett Mullins, the man replied, his gun never wavering. And you, Sheriff, have become something of a problem for our business operations. The name meant nothing to Eli, but something in the man's manner suggested this meeting was far from accidental. The 2 other men, one the stocky individual Martha had described, the other a lean cowboy with dead eyes, had positioned themselves to create a crossfire that would make escape nearly impossible. Your business being cattle theft? Eli asked, calculating distances and angles while keeping his voice steady. Mullins smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. Among other things. You see, Sheriff, you've been asking too many questions, following too many trails, making our work more difficult than it needs to be. Part of the job, Eli said, noting that Chester had gone completely still, the horse's instincts recognizing the danger in the air. Yes. Well, we've decided to offer you a choice, Mullins continued, his educated accent at odds with his profession. You can turn around right now, ride back to Dry Creek, and forget you ever saw anything out here. In return, we'll conduct our business elsewhere and leave your little town alone, and if I refuse. Mullins shrugged with practiced indifference. Then you'll join your predecessors in helping fertilize the desert floor, Eli's jaw tightened as he thought of the 3 sheriffs who had died trying to protect Dry Creek. Can't say that option appeals to me much. Didn't think it would. You Barnes men always were too stubborn for your own good. The comment hit Eli like a physical blow, and he saw Mullins' satisfaction at his reaction. You knew my father? Knew of him? Your daddy killed my daddy 23 years ago. Shot him down in a canyon not 5 miles from here, as a matter of fact. Mullins' voice carried old hatred, carefully nurtured over decades. Been looking forward to settling that debt for a long time. The revelation changed everything. This wasn't just about cattle rustling. It was personal vengeance spanning 2 generations. Eli's father had died when Eli was 30, killed in the line of duty while tracking a gang of bank robbers through similar canyon country. The elder Barnes had never mentioned anyone named Mullins, but then he'd faced so many outlaws over his career that keeping track of their names and grievances would have been impossible. Your father chose his path, Eli said quietly. My father gave him every chance to surrender peacefully. My father was a free man, living off the land as God intended, Mullins snapped, his composure cracking slightly. Your father was just another government badge trying to impose civilization where it didn't belong. Before Eli could respond, Mullins nodded to his companions. The conversation was over. The stocky man, Jake, Mullins called him, spurred his horse forward while the 3rd rider moved to flank Eli's position. There was no time for further negotiation. This had always been intended to end in violence. Eli drew his Colt and fired in one smooth motion. The hours of practice instilled by his father paying off in the split second that often determined life or death. His first shot took the flanking rider in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle with a scream of pain and rage. But Jake was already firing, and Eli felt a burning pain across his ribs as a bullet creased his side. Chester reared and screamed as another shot echoed through the canyon, the sound multiplying and echoing off the rock walls until it seemed like an entire battle was being fought. Eli fought to stay in the saddle while returning fire, his second shot going wide as Chester's movement threw off his aim. The narrow confines of the canyon created a deafening cacophony, making it difficult to determine exactly where the shots were coming from. Smoke from the black powder charges hung in the still air, further obscuring vision and adding to the confusion. Jake's next shot was more carefully aimed. The bullet struck Chester in the neck, and the faithful horse went down hard, his legs folding beneath him as blood fountained from the severed artery. Eli tried to kick free of the stirrups, but Chester's collapse was too sudden. The horse's body pinned Eli's left leg beneath its weight, trapping him in the open with no cover. Pain shot through Eli's ankle as he struggled to free himself, his gun hand still working to keep the rustlers at bay. But the odds were overwhelming. Jake and Mullins closed in from 2 sides, their horses giving them mobility, while Eli remained pinned beneath his dying mount. A lucky shot from Mullins's rifle struck Eli's Colt, sending the weapon spinning from his hand and leaving him defenseless. He could see the blood-stained rope that one of the men was pulling from his saddlebags. They intended to take him alive, at least initially. "Careful with him, boys," Mullins called out as they approached. "I want him conscious for what comes next." A rifle butt to the head ended Eli's resistance. As darkness claimed him, The last thing he heard was Mullins giving orders about an old sawmill and making sure their prisoner would be comfortable for his final hours. When consciousness returned, Eli found himself bound hand and foot in what appeared to be an abandoned building. Sunlight filtered through broken boards and missing roof sections, creating patterns of light and shadow on the dusty floor. The smell of old sawdust and machine oil told him he was in some kind of mill or workshop, probably one of the lumber operations that had thrived in the area before the forests were cut out. His head throbbed where the rifle butt had connected, and his ribs ached from the bullet crease that had torn through his shirt and left a burning track across his side. But he was alive, which meant Mullins had plans that required his continued breathing. Through a gap in the wallboards, Eli could see the sun was low in the sky. He'd been unconscious for hours, which meant the search parties from town would have started looking for him by now. Unfortunately, they'd be searching in the wrong direction, following his original trail instead of the route his captors had taken to reach this abandoned mill. The building itself told a story of failed dreams and economic hardship. Rusted machinery sat beneath tarps that had long since rotted through, and cobwebs hung like curtains in the corners where sunlight never reached. A large circular saw blade, its teeth dulled by years of neglect, dominated one wall like a metallic sun. The wooden floor was littered with sawdust that had turned grey with age and moisture. Eli tested the ropes binding his wrists, finding them tight but not impossible. His captors had been professional but not perfect. They'd left enough slack that circulation wasn't completely cut off, which meant he might be able to work free given enough time and privacy. Footsteps outside announced the return of his captors. Mullins entered first, followed by Jake, whose left arm was now wrapped in a crude bandage stained with dried blood. The third man, the one Eli had shot, was nowhere to be seen, presumably either dead or too badly wounded to continue. "Awake, I see," Mullins observed with satisfaction. "Good. I was beginning to worry we'd hit you too hard." "Thoughtful of you," Eli replied, his voice hoarse from the dry desert air. "Indeed. You see, Sheriff, your death needs to send the right message. Can't have it looking like an accident or a random encounter with hostile Indians. No. The next sheriff needs to understand exactly what happened to you and why." Mullins pulled out a folding knife and opened it slowly, the blade catching the fading sunlight that streamed through the broken roof. "Of course, there's no reason you can't provide us with some useful information before we conclude our business. For instance, how much does the territorial marshal know about our operations?" Eli remained silent, focusing his attention on working the knots that bound his wrists. The rope was new and strong, but whoever had tied it hadn't accounted for the way his hands would swell as his circulation was restricted. "Not talkative." "That's disappointing," Mullins nodded to Jake. "Jake here lost quite a bit of blood thanks to your marksmanship. He's not feeling particularly patient." The stocky man stepped forward with murder in his eyes, but Mullins held up a restraining hand. Jake's face was pale beneath the dirt and stubble, and his wounded arm hung stiffly at his side. The bullet wound was clearly causing him more pain than he wanted to admit. Now, we have plenty of time. The sheriff isn't going anywhere, and we have business to attend to tonight. Another ranch to visit, more cattle to relocate." He smiled at Eli with cold satisfaction. "Your investigation has actually been quite helpful in identifying the most prosperous spreads in the area." "You won't get away with this forever," Eli said, continuing to work at the ropes while keeping his captors talking. "Eventually, someone will track you down, perhaps, but not you, Sheriff, and not anyone from Dry Creek. By the time your body is found, if it's ever found, we'll be operating in different territory entirely." Mullins sheathed his knife and headed for the door. "Jake, keep an eye on our guest. Don't kill him yet. I want him alive when we return tonight. Dead men can't appreciate the artistry of a well-planned revenge." As the two men left the mill, Eli heard their horses departing. He was alone now, with perhaps a few hours before they returned to finish what they'd started. The immediate problem was getting free of the ropes, but even if he managed that, he was miles from anywhere, on foot and injured. Outside, something moved in the brush. Eli strained to see through the gaps in the wall, hoping it might be a search party from town. Instead, he glimpsed a familiar shape, the German shepherd he'd seen in Dry Creek. The dog was moving cautiously, clearly aware that humans had been in the area recently, but drawn by some instinct to investigate. "Here, boy," Eli called softly, not wanting to startle the animal. "Come on, don't be afraid." The dog froze, its ears pricked forward. For a long moment it remained motionless, evaluating this new situation with the careful intelligence of a creature that had learned survival through constant vigilance. Then slowly, it approached the mill, staying low and alert for any sign of danger. Through a gap near the floor, Eli could see the dog's intelligent brown eyes studying him. There was something almost human in that gaze, a recognition of distress and a decision being made about whether to help or flee. "That's it," Eli encouraged, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not going to hurt you. Looks like we're both in need of some friendly company." The dog circled the building twice before settling down outside, just within Eli's line of sight. It seemed to understand that something was wrong, that the man inside was in trouble, but it also recognized the danger that proximity to humans could bring. As the sun set and darkness claimed the canyon, they were two wounded souls keeping each other company while facing an uncertain future. The first day of Eli's captivity passed in a haze of heat and thirst. The abandoned sawmill offered little protection from the desert sun, and his captors had left him no water. By noon his tongue felt thick and swollen, and he found himself thinking more and more about the creek that ran behind his office in Dry Creek. The German shepherd had maintained its vigil throughout the night, disappearing at dawn but returning within an hour. The dog seemed to understand that Eli was in trouble, though it remained too wary to approach close enough for physical contact. Instead, it paced around the mill in wide circles, ears constantly moving as it monitored the surrounding country for signs of danger. Through the gaps in the weathered boards, Eli could observe the animal's behavior and began to piece together its story. The scars on its hide spoke of hard living and violent encounters, some with other animals, others clearly inflicted by human hands. Its lean frame suggested months of surviving on whatever prey it could catch in the harsh desert country. Yet despite its wild appearance, there was something in the dog's movements that spoke of previous training, of a time when it had lived alongside humans and understood their ways. Around midday, the dog suddenly became agitated, its head turning toward the south, where a dust cloud marked the approach of riders. Eli's heart sank as he recognized Mullins and Jake returning from what had obviously been another successful raid. The dog melted into the brush like smoke, vanishing so completely that Eli wondered if he'd imagined its presence. "Still with us, Sheriff?" Mullins called out cheerfully as he dismounted. "Excellent." Jake was worried that the heat might have finished you off before we had our conversation. Jake's face was pale beneath the dirt and stubble, and his wounded arm hung stiffly at his side. The bullet wound was clearly causing him more pain than he wanted to admit, and his eyes held the fevered look of a man fighting infection. "Successful night?" Eli asked, his voice hoarse from lack of water. "Very. The Martinez Ranch lost 15 head of prime breeding stock. Amazing how much easier it is when the local sheriff isn't interfering with business operations." Mullins pulled out a water bottle and took a long drink, deliberately making sure Eli could see and hear every swallow. The sound of liquid was torture to a man whose mouth felt like cotton, and whose lips were already beginning to crack. "Thirsty, Sheriff?" "I imagine you are. Desert can be cruel to a man with no water." "Get on with it," Eli rasped. "Whatever you're planning to do, just do it." Such impatience. "You know, your father said almost exactly the same thing before I shot him." Mullins smiled at Eli's shocked expression. "Oh yes, I was there that day, watched from the rocks, while Ranger Barnes tracked my father to his camp. Listened to him offer the same choice I offered you, surrender and face trial, or die in the canyon." Eli's mind reeled with this revelation. His father had never mentioned the presence of witnesses during that final confrontation, but then Samuel Barnes had never been one to dwell on the violent aspects of his work. He'd always focused on the law enforcement part of his job, the protection of innocent people rather than the punishment of the guilty. "My father gave your father every chance to surrender peacefully," Eli said, his voice gaining strength from righteous anger. "My father was a free man living off the land as God intended. Your father was just another government badge trying to impose civilization where it didn't belong." Mullen's voice carried old anger, carefully nurtured over decades. "But that's ancient history. What matters now is balancing the scales." Meanwhile, hidden in a cluster of rocks 50 yards from the mill, the German shepherd watched and listened. The animal's intelligence, sharpened by months of surviving on its own, had allowed it to piece together the basic situation. The injured human inside the building was in danger from the two men with guns. More importantly, the dog recognized the scent of fear and pain emanating from the mill, emotions that triggered something deep in its domesticated past. The dog had not always been wild. 3 years earlier, it had belonged to a family named Patterson, who had tried to establish a ranch in the foothills north of Dry Creek. The animal, then called Rex, had been trained as both a working dog and a companion, taught to herd cattle, guard property, and protect the family's children. The Apache raid that destroyed the Patterson ranch had come without warning on a moonless night in October. The dog had fought bravely to defend its human family, but the odds had been overwhelming. When dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, Rex was the only survivor, wounded and traumatized, but alive. He'd waited for 3 days beside the graves the soldiers had dug, hoping against hope that his family would somehow return. When they didn't, the dog had struck out into the wilderness, reverting to instincts that predated thousands of years of domestication. He'd learned to hunt jackrabbits and prairie dogs, to find water in hidden springs, and to avoid the two-legged creatures that had brought such violence into his world. But the training and loyalty instilled during his domestic years had never completely disappeared. They had simply been buried beneath the necessity of survival. Now, watching the bound human in the mill and sensing his distress, those old instincts stirred. This man's scent carried no threat, no violence, only pain and a quiet determination that reminded the dog of his former master's strength in the face of adversity. As the afternoon wore on, the heat became almost unbearable. Eli's head pounded, and he found himself drifting in and out of consciousness. During one of these periods, he thought he saw the German shepherd creeping closer to the mill, but when he focused his eyes, nothing was there. The dog, however, was very much present, conducting a careful reconnaissance of the building and its surroundings. It had witnessed the arrival of the two men, had seen them enter the building where the injured human was being held, and had made the connection that these were the sources of danger. The animal's intelligence told it that the man in the building needed help, but that direct intervention would likely result in its own death. Around the mill, the dog found several items that carried the injured man's scent: a piece of torn cloth caught on a nail, drops of dried blood on the wooden steps, and most importantly, a metal water canteen that had apparently been dropped during the struggle. The dog sniffed the canteen carefully, recognizing both the man's scent and the smell of water that had once been contained within. Water was life in the desert, and the dog understood this fundamental truth better than most creatures. If the man inside the building was going to survive, he would need water. But the nearest reliable source was the spring where the dog itself drank, more than a mile away through difficult terrain. As evening approached, Jake's condition worsened noticeably. His face was flushed with fever, and he swayed on his feet when he tried to stand. The bullet wound, inadequately treated and subjected to a full day of hard riding, was clearly becoming infected. "Boss," Jake mumbled, his speech slurred. "I need to get to a doctor. This arm's going bad." Mullins examined his companion with the dispassionate eye of a man accustomed to violence and its consequences. Nearest doctor's in Dry Creek, and I don't think Sheriff Barnes's friends would give you a warm welcome. Then what? Then you'll have to tough it out until we finish here and move on. There are doctors in Silver City, assuming you can make it that far. Jake's face went pale. Boss, I'm telling you, this wound's festering. I can smell it myself. If I don't get help soon, if you don't stop whining, you'll have bigger problems than a sore arm, Mullins snapped. We finish the job we came here to do, then we move on. That's how it works. Through the walls of the mill, Eli could hear the tension between his captors and filed the information away as potentially useful. Desperate men made mistakes, and mistakes created opportunities. He continued working at the ropes around his wrists, making slow but steady progress as the fibers gradually loosened. As night fell, the German shepherd made a decision that would change the course of events. The dog had found a loose board near the back of the mill, a section where the wood had warped and pulled away from its nails, leaving a gap just large enough for a determined animal to squeeze through. Moving with the silence that had kept it alive in the wilderness, the dog slipped into the mill. Inside, the familiar scent of the injured human was stronger, mixed with the sharp smell of fear and the metallic tang of blood. The dog approached Eli's position cautiously, every sense alert for signs of danger. Eli felt warm breath on his face and nearly cried out before recognizing the distinctive smell of the German shepherd. The dog had somehow gotten inside the mill and was examining him with the thorough attention of an animal trying to understand a complex situation. Easy, boy, Eli whispered, hardly daring to believe his eyes. How did you get in here? The dog seemed to understand that silence was essential. It pressed close to Eli, offering warmth and companionship in the cold desert night. For the first time since his capture, Eli felt something resembling hope. The animal had demonstrated remarkable intelligence in avoiding detection while staying close enough to monitor the situation. You're a smart one, aren't you? Eli murmured, feeling the dog's warm fur against his bound hands. Smarter than those two out there give anyone credit for. For several minutes, they remained motionless, man and dog, drawing comfort from each other's presence. Then the dog began to do something extraordinary. It started pawing gently at the ropes around Eli's wrists, its teeth carefully gripping the fibers and pulling in a way that helped loosen the knots. It was as if the animal understood exactly what needed to be done. Working together in the darkness, they made more progress on the bonds in 20 minutes than Eli had managed in hours of solitary effort. Day 2 of Eli's captivity brought with it a fever that made the desert heat feel almost cool by comparison. His body was fighting the infection from his bullet wound, and dehydration was taking its toll on his ability to think clearly. Through the haze of illness, he continued working at the ropes, but his progress had slowed considerably. The German shepherd had returned with something in its mouth, a torn piece of fabric that Eli recognized as part of his own shirt. The dog had found it caught on a nail where the gang had dragged him into the mill, and now it lay the cloth near the gap in the wall where Eli could see it. The animal seemed to understand that this scrap of evidence was important, though for what purpose remained unclear. Smart boy, Eli whispered through cracked lips. You're trying to help, aren't you? The dog's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, and it moved closer to the wall. For the first time since the ordeal began, it made a soft, whining sound, not of distress but of communication. It was trying to tell him something, though Eli's fevered mind struggled to understand what. Meanwhile, in Dry Creek, Doc Henley was organizing the largest search party the town had ever mounted. When Chester had returned riderless the previous evening, blood-stained and bearing obvious bullet wounds, the worst fears of the townspeople had been confirmed. Their sheriff was in trouble, and this time, they weren't going to wait for the territorial marshal to send help. Martha, you take the group searching the southern canyons, Doc instructed, his medical bag secured to his saddle alongside his rifle. Mayor Caldwell, you and your men cover the eastern approaches. I'll lead the main party north, following the most likely trail. Martha checked her Winchester one final time before mounting her horse. Doc, what if we find him and he's... We don't think about that until we have to, Doc replied firmly. Eli's a tough man, tougher than his father in some ways. If there's a way to survive out there, he'll find it. The search parties spread out across the canyon country like fingers extending from a hand, each group following different trails and checking every possible hiding place. They rode with the urgency of people who understood that time was running out, that every hour of delay made survival less likely in the unforgiving desert. Back at the sawmill, the dog had begun exhibiting behavior that suggested it was forming a plan. It would disappear for hours at a time, always returning with something. A stick, a rock, once even a dead rabbit that it left near the wall as if making an offering. Each return trip brought it closer to the building, as if it was gradually overcoming its natural wariness through sheer determination. During one of these absences, Eli managed to work his right hand partially free of the ropes. The circulation returning to his fingers was painful but wonderful, and he flexed them carefully to restore feeling and strength. The torn piece of his shirt gave him an idea. If the dog was intelligent enough to recognize that the fabric was significant, perhaps it was smart enough to understand more complex communication. When the animal returned from its next scouting trip, Eli began talking to it in a steady, low voice. He told it about Dry Creek, about the people who were probably looking for him, about the need to somehow let them know where he was. The dog listened with an intensity that suggested it understood far more than seemed possible. "I need you to go back to town, boy," Eli said, pushing the piece of torn shirt through the gap in the wall. "Take this with you. Show them where you found it. Lead them back here." The dog approached the fabric cautiously, sniffing it thoroughly before taking it gently in its mouth. For a moment their eyes met through the gap in the wall, and Eli saw something that took his breath away: intelligence, understanding, and a decision being made. Then the animal was gone, disappearing into the afternoon heat with the piece of shirt clutched carefully in its jaws. Eli could only hope that his fevered mind hadn't imagined the entire exchange, that somewhere in the vast canyon country, a stray dog was carrying his last hope for survival toward the only people who might be able to help him. The search party, led by Doc Henley, had been following a promising trail for most of the afternoon when they encountered the dog. The animal appeared suddenly from behind a rock formation, the piece of blood-stained fabric visible in its mouth. At first, the men raised their rifles, thinking it might be a wolf or coyote, but Doc recognized the German shepherd from its visits to town. "Hold your fire," he called out. "That's the stray that's been hanging around Dry Creek." The dog stopped about 50 yards away, dropping the fabric on the ground before retreating to a safe distance. It barked once, a sharp sound that echoed off the canyon walls, then picked up the cloth again and started trotting away from the search party. "I'll be damned," muttered one of the townsmen. "That dog's trying to tell us something." Doc Henley dismounted and approached the spot where the fabric had been dropped. The bloodstains were fresh enough to belong to Eli, and the torn edges matched the sheriff's shirt. More importantly, the dog's behavior suggested it knew where the sheriff was and wanted them to follow. "Men, I think we just found our guide," Doc announced. "That animal knows something we don't." The dog led them on a winding route through terrain that would have been nearly impossible to navigate without someone familiar with the hidden trails and safe passages. It moved with purpose and intelligence, frequently looking back to make sure the humans were following, adjusting its pace to accommodate their slower progress. As the afternoon wore on, the dog's urgency became more apparent. It would run ahead, disappear for minutes at a time, then return to bark impatiently at the search party before setting off again. The message was clear. Time was running out. Back at the sawmill, Eli had fallen into a delirious state where reality and memory blended together. He found himself having conversations with his father, reliving moments from his childhood when the world had seemed simpler and justice was clearly defined. In his fevered dreams, Samuel Barnes offered advice about courage, duty, and the importance of never giving up even when the odds seemed impossible. "A man's character isn't tested when times are easy, son," his father's voice seemed to say. "It's tested when everything seems lost, and the easy choice would be to quit." That's when you find out what you're really made of. The sound of approaching horses pulled Eli back to consciousness. For a moment he hoped it might be the search party, but the familiar voices of Mullins and Jake dashed that hope. They had returned to check on their prisoner and to begin the final phase of their revenge. "Still breathing, I see," Mullins observed as he entered the mill. "Good. Jake's condition has taken a turn for the worse, so we'll need to conclude our business sooner than planned." Jake indeed looked terrible. The infection from his bullet wound had spread, giving his skin a grayish pallor and causing him to sway on his feet. His eyes held the glassy stare of a man running a high fever, and his speech was becoming increasingly slurred. "Boss," Jake mumbled, "I need to get to a doctor soon. This arm's going bad fast." Mullins examined his companion with the cold calculation of a man weighing assets and liabilities. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Jake, but don't worry. After tonight, it won't matter anymore." The implication was clear. Mullins planned to kill both Eli and Jake, eliminating witnesses and loose ends as he prepared to move his operation to new territory. The personal vendetta against the Barnes family would finally be settled, and the cattle-rustling business would continue elsewhere, with no one left to testify about what had happened in the canyon country around Dry Creek. As darkness fell over the sawmill, Eli could only hope that somewhere in the vast desert a loyal dog was leading help toward him. Time was running out, and soon Mullins would tire of waiting and finish what he'd started. The torn piece of shirt had been his last message to the world. Whether anyone would understand it remained to be seen. Day 3 brought Eli to his weakest point. The fever had broken during the night, leaving him drenched in sweat, but more clear-headed than he'd been since the capture. His lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration, and his injured ankle had swollen to twice its normal size. Yet somewhere in the distance he could hear something that gave him hope. The faint sound of dogs barking. The German shepherd had not returned alone. Through the gaps in the mill's walls, Eli could see movement in the rocks above. Riders approaching cautiously, their horses picking their way carefully down the treacherous slope. The dog had done the impossible. It had found the search party and led them back. Doc Henley was the first to spot the abandoned sawmill. Its broken roof and weathered walls, a stark reminder of better times when the timber industry had brought prosperity to these remote canyons. He raised his hand to halt the search party, studying the building through a pair of field glasses. "That's got to be it," he whispered to Martha, who had insisted on joining his group despite the dangerous terrain. "The dog led us straight here." The German shepherd sat on a rocky outcropping above the mill, watching the humans with intense concentration. Occasionally, it would look toward the building and whine softly, as if trying to communicate the urgency of the situation inside. Martha checked her rifle and studied the approaches to the mill. "I don't see any horses. Maybe the rustlers aren't here, or maybe they're being careful," Doc replied. "Either way, we go in quiet and ready for trouble." Inside the mill, Eli had managed to work both hands free of the ropes, though his fingers were numb and nearly useless from poor circulation. He was working on the bonds around his ankles when he heard footsteps outside. Not the heavy boots of his captors, but the careful, measured steps of people trying to move silently. "Sheriff Barnes?" Doc Henley's voice called softly through the walls.
"Are you in there?"
Relief flooded through Eli like cool water. "Doc, yes, I'm here." "Be careful. There may be guards." The rescue party spread out around the building, checking for threats before Doc and Martha approached the main entrance. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, and sunlight streamed through gaps in the walls where boards had warped and fallen away. They found Eli in the corner where Mullins had left him, his wrists bleeding from the ropes and his shirt torn and stained with blood from the bullet crease. But he was alive, conscious, and already working to free himself from the remaining bonds. "Sweet Jesus," Martha breathed, kneeling beside him with her water bottle. "Eli, what did they do to you?" "Nothing I can't recover from," Eli replied, accepting the water gratefully. "But we need to get out of here quick." Mullins and his partner will be back soon, and they're planning to finish what they started. Doc Henley began examining Eli's injuries with professional efficiency. The bullet wound was superficial but needed cleaning, and the ankle was badly sprained but not broken. More concerning was the dehydration and the early signs of heat exhaustion. "Can you ride?" Doc asked, checking Eli's pulse and pupils. "I'll have to. These men aren't just cattle rustlers, Doc. This is personal, revenge for something that happened between my father and Mullins' father 23 years ago." As they helped Eli to his feet, the German shepherd appeared in the doorway. The animal had somehow made its way down from the rocks and now stood watching the reunion with what could only be described as satisfaction. Its tail wagged once, a brief expression of joy at seeing the injured human being helped by his pack. "That dog saved your life," Martha said, offering her hand to the animal. For the first time since anyone in Dry Creek had seen it, the shepherd allowed a human to touch it, accepting Martha's gentle pat with dignity. "More than saved it," Eli replied, scratching the dog behind the ears. "He's been watching over me for 3 days, brought you that piece of my shirt, led you here. I've never seen anything like it." They were preparing to leave when the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon. The search party had found Eli, but Mullins and Jake were returning from their night raid, and the narrow canyon offered limited options for escape. "How many men?" Doc asked, checking his rifle. "2, but they're professional killers. Jake's wounded and running a fever, but Mullins is dangerous as a rattlesnake." Martha positioned herself behind a fallen beam where she could cover the entrance. "We didn't come this far to lose you now, Sheriff." The German shepherd's ears pricked forward, and it moved to a position where it could see the approach to the mill. A low growl rumbled in its throat, not the sound of an animal afraid, but one prepared to defend its pack. Garrett Mullins' voice echoed off the canyon walls as he spotted the horses belonging to the search party. Well, it seems our sheriff has found some friends. Jake, looks like we'll have more graves to dig than we planned." "I can barely stay in the saddle, boss," Jake replied, his words slurred by fever. "Maybe we should just cut our losses and run." "Not a chance. I've waited 23 years for this moment. A few extra bodies won't change anything." Inside the mill, Eli was checking the loads in his recovered Colt revolver. One of the search party members had found it near the spot where Chester had fallen and brought it along. The familiar weight of the weapon in his hand was reassuring, though he knew the odds were still against them. "Doc, I need you and the others to get back to town," Eli said. "This isn't your fight." "Like hell it isn't," Martha replied firmly. "You're our sheriff, and that makes it our fight too." The standoff that followed would later be remembered as one of the most tense moments in Dry Creek's history. Mullins and Jake had taken positions behind rocks outside the mill, while the rescue party found cover inside the building. Neither side had a clear advantage, but time was on Mullins' side. He could wait for reinforcements or try to starve them out. What none of the humans anticipated was the role the German shepherd would play in the coming confrontation. The dog had positioned itself where it could observe both groups, and its keen senses detected something the people had missed: the sound of more horses approaching from the south. A third group was converging on the sawmill, and the dog's behavior suggested these new arrivals were different from either the rustlers or the rescue party. Its hackles rose, and it moved protectively closer to Eli, sensing that the situation was about to become much more complicated. In his vest pocket, Eli fingered the hand-carved wooden cross his father had made years earlier, a simple piece of pine whittled during long nights on the trail, carried through countless dangerous situations as a reminder of faith and family. Samuel Barnes had carried it through his final confrontation with the elder Mullins, and now it had come full circle to witness the conclusion of a vendetta that had spanned 2 generations. "Whatever happens next," Eli said quietly to Doc and Martha, "I want you to know that I'm grateful. For the rescue, for the friendship, for giving a stranger a chance to prove himself worthy of wearing this badge." The wooden cross seemed to warm in his hand, and for a moment, Eli could almost hear his father's voice offering guidance. "Sometimes a man has to stand alone against evil, son. But the best lawmen know when to accept help from unexpected places. As if summoned by that thought, the German shepherd moved to Eli's side and sat down, its intelligent eyes fixed on the mill entrance. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The sheriff, his friends, and a loyal dog who had chosen to cast his lot with the forces of justice and law. The third group of riders turned out to be a patrol of territorial marshals who had been tracking Mullins' gang across 3 counties. Their timing was both fortunate and dangerous. They had no way of knowing that innocent townspeople were trapped inside the mill with the very sheriff they'd been sent to find. Marshal Tom Briggs, a veteran lawman with 20 years of experience, studied the situation through his field glasses. He could see 2 men positioned behind rocks outside the mill, clearly armed and dangerous. What he couldn't see was the rescue party inside, or the German shepherd that had become the unlikely catalyst for this confrontation. "Looks like we found our cattle rustlers," Briggs told his deputy. "Set up a perimeter and be ready for a fight." Inside the mill, Eli recognized the sound of military-style movement and realized that more complications were arriving. "That's got to be federal marshals," he told Doc. "They'll think we're all rustlers if we're not careful." The German shepherd sensed the increasing tension and began pacing near the entrance to the mill. Its behavior suggested that it was evaluating multiple threats and trying to determine the safest course of action for its human pack. Mullins, meanwhile, had recognized the marshal patrol for what it was and realized his situation had become untenable. With Jake barely conscious from fever and blood loss, facing professional lawmen instead of small-town volunteers, his options were rapidly disappearing. "Jake!" he hissed. "We need to get out of here now." But Jake was beyond responding coherently. The infection from his bullet wound had spread through his system, and he was slipping in and out of consciousness. Mullins faced the bitter reality that his partner had become more liability than asset. The standoff continued for nearly an hour, with each side waiting for the other to make the first move. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, and inside the mill, the rescued sheriff was beginning to feel the effects of his ordeal despite Doc Henley's medical attention. It was the German shepherd who broke the stalemate. The dog had been observing all 3 groups with the analytical mind of a creature whose survival depended on reading situations correctly. Somehow it understood that the marshals outside were not enemies, but potential allies, different from the men who had hurt its human friend, with a decision that spoke to an intelligence that transcended species. The dog walked calmly out of the mill and approached the marshal patrol. Its behavior was neither aggressive nor submissive. It carried itself with the dignity of an emissary seeking parley. Marshal Briggs watched in amazement as the scarred German shepherd approached his position, stopped at a respectful distance, and sat down. The animal looked directly at him with eyes that seemed almost human in their intelligence. "I'll be damned," the marshal muttered. "That dog's trying to tell us something." The shepherd stood up, looked back toward the mill, then returned its gaze to the marshal. It repeated this behavior 3 times before Briggs began to understand. The dog was indicating that there were friends inside the building, not enemies. "Deputy, I think we may have misread this situation," Briggs said. "That animal's behavior suggests there are friendlies in that mill." Meanwhile, Mullins was growing desperate. His careful plan for revenge was unraveling, and he could see armed men moving to surround his position. In his twisted logic, if he couldn't have his revenge on Eli Barnes specifically, he could at least ensure that the sheriff died in the crossfire of a larger battle. "If I can't kill you properly," Mullins called out toward the mill, "at least I can make sure you don't survive this day." He began firing wildly at the mill, forcing the rescue party to take cover while simultaneously drawing the attention of the marshal patrol. His plan was to create enough chaos that everyone would start shooting, hoping that stray bullets would finish what he couldn't accomplish personally. The German shepherd reacted instantly to the gunfire. Instead of fleeing to safety, it ran directly toward Mullins's position, drawing fire away from the mill where its human pack was sheltered. The dog's courage was both inspiring and heartbreaking. It was willing to sacrifice itself to protect the people who had shown it kindness. Eli saw what was happening and couldn't bear to watch the brave animal put itself in danger for his sake. Despite his injuries and Doc's protests, he dragged himself to the mill entrance and began returning fire, trying to suppress Mullen's shots and protect the dog. "That animal's got more courage than most men I've known," Martha said. Adding her rifle fire to Eli's, Marshal Briggs had seen enough to understand the true situation. The dog's behavior, combined with the defensive rather than aggressive posture of the people in the mill, and told him everything he needed to know about who were the good guys and who were the bad guys. "All right, boys," he called to his patrol. "Let's end this. The rustlers are the two behind the rocks, not the folks in the mill." The Marshal Patrol moved with professional efficiency, using their superior numbers and position to close the noose around Mullins and the barely conscious Jake. The German Shepherd, still in the line of fire, suddenly found itself with allies as the Marshal's shots forced Mullins to keep his head down. In desperation, Mullins made one final attempt to complete his vendetta. He broke from cover, charging directly toward the mill with his gun blazing, hoping to get close enough to finish Eli Barnes with his bare hands if necessary. It was a suicidal move, and the German Shepherd recognized it as such. The dog intercepted Mullins' charge, leaping at the rustler with the fearless determination of an animal protecting its pack. The impact knocked Mullins off balance, spoiling his aim and giving Marshal Briggs a clear shot. The Marshal's bullet took Mullins in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the rocky ground. His gun went flying, landing several yards away and ending the immediate threat. Jake, meanwhile, had collapsed completely, his fever finally claiming the last of his strength. Doc Henley, despite everything the man had done, moved to provide medical assistance, his oath as a physician overriding any personal feelings about the wounded rustler. "He'll live," Doc announced after a quick examination, "but he needs proper medical care soon or the infection will kill him." As the smoke cleared and the shooting stopped, Eli found himself face to face with the German Shepherd who had risked everything to save him. The dog was panting heavily and had a graze along its flank where one of Mullins' bullets had come too close. But it was alive and wagging its tail. "You're quite a partner," Eli said, kneeling down to examine the dog's wound. "I don't know what I did to deserve such loyalty, but I'm grateful for it." Marshal Briggs approached the mill, his weapon holstered and his hands visible. "Sheriff Barnes, I presume?" "I'm Marshal Tom Briggs, Territorial Law Enforcement. We've been tracking this gang for months." "Glad to see you, Marshal," Eli replied, struggling to his feet with Martha's assistance. "Though I have to say, your timing could have been better." Briggs chuckled and gestured toward the German Shepherd. "Looks like this dog of yours was the real hero today. Never seen an animal show that kind of tactical intelligence." "He's not mine," Eli said, then paused and looked down at the loyal animal. "Though I reckon after what we've been through together, maybe it's time that changed." The rusted sawmill bell, silent for years, caught the afternoon light as a breeze moved through the canyon. Once it had called workers to their daily tasks, bringing life and purpose to this remote place. Now it bore witness to a different kind of purpose, the moment when a man and a dog chose each other as partners in the endless struggle between order and chaos as they prepared to leave the sawmill and return to Dry Creek. Eli realized that something fundamental had changed. He was no longer the solitary lawman carrying the burden of protecting an entire town. He had found not just a companion, but a true partner whose courage and loyalty had saved not only his life, but the lives of everyone who had risked themselves to rescue him. The German Shepherd walked beside Eli's horse as they began the journey home, no longer a stray animal wandering the wilderness alone, but a member of a pack that included not just one man, but an entire community that had learned the value of standing together against those who would harm the innocent. 1 week after the rescue, Eli sat in his office reviewing the paperwork that Marshal Briggs had left behind. The federal investigation into Mullins' cattle rustling operation had revealed the scope of their crimes, Dozens of ranches hit across 3 territories, hundreds of stolen cattle, and a network of corrupt buyers who had knowingly purchased stolen livestock. Jake had survived his infected wound, but was now facing federal charges that would likely put him away for the rest of his life. Mullins, his shoulder wound healing slowly, was being held in the territorial prison while awaiting trial for murder, cattle theft, and kidnapping a federal law enforcement officer. The German shepherd, whom Eli had started calling Deputy, much to the amusement of the townspeople, lay on a blanket in the corner of the office. The dog's bullet graze had healed cleanly, thanks to Doc Henley's careful treatment, and it had taken to its unofficial role as assistant lawman with remarkable dedication. Eli was studying a wanted poster that Marshal Briggs had included in the case files when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The poster showed a man named Samuel Mullins, wanted for bank robbery and murder 23 years earlier. The face was older and more weathered than Garrett Mullins, but the resemblance was unmistakable. This was clearly the rustler's father. What shocked Eli, however, was the notation at the bottom of the poster: killed resisting arrest by Texas Ranger Samuel Barnes, October 15, 1851. The date was burned into Eli's memory. It was the day his father had been killed. With trembling hands, Eli pulled out the leather portfolio that contained his father's personal effects, including the journal the elder Barnes had kept during his final case. He'd never read it completely, finding the pain of his father's death too fresh even after all these years. Now, however, he forced himself to examine the entries from those last fateful days. The journal revealed a story that Garrett Mullins had either never known or had chosen to ignore. Samuel Barnes hadn't been hunting the elder Mullins when they met in that canyon. 23 years ago, he'd been responding to a report that someone was trapped in a flash flood. October 14, 1851. Received word from a Mexican shepherd that someone was calling for help from the Canyon del Muerte after yesterday's storm. Riding out at first light to investigate, October 15, 1851. Found man trapped on ledge, badly injured from fall. Attempted rescue, but discovered he was Samuel Mullins, wanted for murder in 3 territories. Offered him medical attention and safe transport to face trial if he would surrender peacefully. The journal entry continued in his father's careful handwriting. Mullins refused surrender, said he'd rather die than face a rope. Drew weapon and fired at me despite his injuries. Was forced to return fire in self-defense. Mullins died instantly. Found young boy hidden in rocks nearby. His son, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Boy saw everything but ran before I could reach him. Eli read the entry 3 times before the full implication sank in. His father hadn't hunted down and killed Samuel Mullins in cold blood. He'd been trying to rescue him, and Garrett Mullins had witnessed his father's death. But from the perspective of a frightened child who couldn't understand the complex circumstances that had led to the shooting, the revelation changed. Everything Eli thought he knew about the vendetta that had nearly cost him his life. Garrett Mullins had spent 23 years nursing a hatred based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what had actually happened in that canyon. Deputy seemed to sense Eli's distress and moved from his blanket to rest his head on Eli's knee. The dog's warm presence was comforting, a reminder that sometimes the truth was more complicated than it appeared on the surface. "What am I supposed to do with this boy?" Eli asked, scratching behind the dog's ears. "The man tried to kill me over something that never really happened the way he thought it did." There was a knock on the office door, and Doc Henley entered without waiting for permission, a privilege earned through decades of friendship with the badge-wearers of Dry Creek. "You look like a man who's seen a ghost," Doc observed, settling into the chair across from Eli's desk. "What's got you so troubled?" Eli handed over the journal and the wanted poster, watching Doc's face as the older man read through the material. Doc's medical training had taught him to pay attention to details, and it didn't take him long to understand the significance of what he was reading. "Sweet Lord," Doc breathed. That boy spent his whole life hating your father for something that wasn't even your father's fault. Makes you wonder what else we think we know that isn't true, Eli replied. Mullins built his entire adult life around revenge for a perceived injustice that never actually happened. Doc set the papers down and studied Eli's face. So what are you going to do about it? I don't know. Part of me thinks justice would be served by letting him face the consequences of his choices. But another part, the part that sounds like my father's voice, says that maybe the truth deserves to be told. Buty lifted his head and looked toward the door a moment before they heard footsteps on the wooden porch outside. Martha appeared in the doorway, her expression serious. "Sheriff, you've got a visitor. Federal Marshal says it's important." Marshal Briggs entered behind Martha, his face bearing the grim expression of a man with unpleasant news to deliver. "Sheriff Barnes, I'm afraid I have some concerning information about Garrett Mullins." "What kind of information?" Eli asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Mullins has been asking to speak with you. Says he has information about other gang members we haven't caught yet, but he'll only talk to you directly. The federal prosecutor thinks it might be worth hearing what he has to say." Eli looked down at his father's journal, then at the wanted poster that had revealed the truth about that long-ago confrontation. "Marshal, before I decide whether to talk to Mullins, there's something you need to know." He handed over the documents and watched as Briggs read through them with the same shocked expression that had crossed Doc's face. The marshal was quiet for a long time, processing the implications of what the journal revealed. "This changes things," Briggs said finally. "If Mullins knew the truth about what happened to his father, but he doesn't know," Eli interrupted. "He was just a child when it happened, and he spent his whole life believing a lie. The question is whether knowing the truth would make any difference now." Martha had been listening from the doorway, and now she stepped into the office. "Seems to me that everyone deserves to know the truth, even if it comes too late to change what they've done." Deputy moved to the window and looked out toward the street, his keen senses detecting something the humans had missed. A moment later, they heard the sound of an approaching wagon, the territorial prison transport, bringing Garrett Mullins to Dry Creek for his meeting with Eli. "Well," Eli said, standing up and checking his sidearm, "I guess we'll find out what 23 years of misplaced hatred looks like when it meets the truth." The wagon stopped in front of the sheriff's office, and 2 guards escorted Garrett Mullins up the steps. The rustler looked older and more haggard than he had during their confrontation at the sawmill. His wounded shoulder was still causing him pain, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who had lost everything he'd ever worked for. "Sheriff Barnes," Mullins said as the guard seated him in the chair across from Eli's desk. "I suppose you're wondering why I wanted to see you." "I'm wondering about a lot of things," Eli replied, his father's journal lying open on the desk between them. "But first, I think there's something you need to know about the day your father died." Mullins' expression hardened. "I know everything I need to know about that day. I was there, remember? I saw your father gun down mine in cold blood." "You saw a scared 8-year-old boy's version of what happened," Eli said gently. "But that boy didn't understand what he was seeing." He turned the journal around so Mullins could read his father's account of that October day 23 years earlier. At first, the rustler's face showed only skepticism, but as he read through the detailed account, his expression began to change. "That's impossible," Mullins whispered. "My father was a proud man. He would never have needed rescuing." "Your father was a human being," Eli replied. "Human beings get caught in flash floods. They fall from ledges. They get hurt and need help, regardless of what they might have done in the past." Mullins read through the journal entry 3 times, his face growing paler with each reading. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a confusion that spoke to a world-view being fundamentally challenged. "If this is true," he said slowly, "then everything I've done, everything you've done, was based on what an 8-year-old boy thought he saw," Eli finished. "But you're not 8 years old anymore, Mullins. You're a grown man who chose to become a killer and a thief. The truth about your father's death doesn't change the choices you've made since then." The revelation had broken something fundamental in Garrett Mullins. The hatred that had sustained him for more than 2 decades was suddenly gone, replaced by a devastating understanding of how wrong he had been about everything. Deputy, who had been watching the exchange with the intense attention he brought to all human interactions, suddenly stood up and walked over to Mullins. The dog studied the broken man for a moment, then did something that surprised everyone in the room. He rested his head on Mullins' knee, offering comfort to someone who had tried to kill his human partner. "Even the dog has more forgiveness than I deserve," Mullins said, his voice barely above a whisper. The truth about his father's death had shattered Garrett Mullins' worldview, but it also provided an unexpected opportunity. In his broken state, he began revealing information about his criminal network that Marshal Briggs had been trying to uncover for months. There were corrupt cattle buyers in Silver City, a fence operation in Santa Fe, and most importantly, 3 more gang members who were planning to continue the rustling operation under new leadership. "They'll hit Dry Creek next week," Mullins said, his voice hollow with defeat. "The Harvest Festival provides perfect cover. Lots of strangers in town, everyone distracted by the celebration. They plan to take every head of cattle from the surrounding ranches while the owners are at the festival." Eli exchanged glances with Marshal Briggs. The Harvest Festival was Dry Creek's biggest celebration of the year, a 3-day event that brought people from all over the territory to trade, socialize, and forget the hardships of frontier life for a little while. "How many men?" Briggs asked. 8, maybe 10. "They've recruited some new talent since Jake and I were captured. Professional gunmen from Texas and New Mexico, men who kill for money rather than principle." Doc Henley, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "We'll have to cancel the festival. It's too dangerous." "No," Eli said firmly. "If we cancel, they'll just wait and hit us when we're not expecting it. Better to be ready for them when we know they're coming." Deputy seemed to sense the tension in the room and moved closer to Eli's chair. The dog had become remarkably attuned to his human partner's moods, and the prospect of more danger had put him on alert. "Sheriff's right," Marshal Briggs agreed. "We use the festival as bait and set up a trap. My men and I will be in position to help when they make their move." Over the next 3 days, Eli worked with the townspeople to prepare for the coming confrontation. It was decided that the festival would proceed as planned, but with armed men strategically positioned throughout the town and the surrounding area. The goal was to protect the innocent while ensuring that the remaining gang members could be captured alive to face justice. The blacksmith, Jim Morrison, had been working on a special project at Eli's request, a deputy badge sized perfectly for a German shepherd's collar. The badge was hand-forged from the same silver used for human law enforcement badges, engraved with simple but elegant lettering, "Deputy Dry Creek Sheriff's Office." "Never thought I'd be making a badge for a dog," Morrison said, as he polished the finished piece. "But after what that animal did at the sawmill, I reckon he's earned it." Eli examined the badge with satisfaction. Deputy had proven himself a true partner in law enforcement, and it was time to make that partnership official. The ceremony would take place during the festival, giving the townspeople something positive to focus on amid their concerns about the anticipated attack. Martha had organized the women of the town to prepare for casualties, setting up a medical station in the church and stocking it with bandages, medicine and other supplies that Doc Henley might need. The church's bell tower also provided an excellent vantage point for spotting approaching riders. "I still think we should evacuate the children," Martha said, as she checked the medical supplies for the 3rd time. "Where would we send them?" Eli asked. "The whole territory is dangerous right now. At least here we can protect them." Mayor Caldwell had initially opposed the plan to use the festival as a trap, but the unanimous support of the townspeople had eventually won him over. "If this goes wrong," he told Eli, "we could lose everything. The town, the people, our entire way of life. If we run now," Eli replied, "we'll be running for the rest of our lives. These men won't stop until someone stops them." As the first day of the festival arrived, Dry Creek filled with visitors from surrounding ranches and settlements. The streets buzzed with activity as merchants set up their stalls, musicians tuned their instruments, and children ran between the adults with the infectious excitement that only comes with special occasions. Deputy wore his new badge with obvious pride, the silver star catching the sunlight as he patrolled the town alongside Eli. The dog seemed to understand that this was an important day, and his alertness was even more pronounced than usual. "You're quite the sight," Eli told his four-legged partner. "First official canine deputy in the territory, as far as I know." The ceremony to officially swear in deputy took place in the town square at noon, with what seemed like half the territory in attendance. Judge Hamilton, who had ridden over from the county seat specifically for the occasion, performed the honors with appropriate solemnity. "Do you, Sheriff Eli Barnes, take this animal as your lawful deputy to serve and protect the citizens of Dry Creek to the best of his ability?" "I do," Eli replied, pinning the badge to Deputy's collar as the crowd cheered. Deputy sat perfectly still during the ceremony, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. When the crowd applauded, his tail wagged once, a brief acknowledgement of the honor being bestowed upon him. But even as the town celebrated, Eli and Marshal Briggs kept watch for signs of the approaching gang. Their men were positioned at key points throughout the town and the surrounding hills, ready to spring the trap when the rustlers made their move. The attack came on the second day of the festival, just as Mullins had predicted. 8 riders approached Dry Creek from 3 different directions, timing their arrival to coincide with the afternoon when most people would be gathered in the town square for the dancing and competitions. Deputy was the first to sense their approach. His ears pricked up, and he began pacing nervously, drawing Eli's attention to movement on the eastern ridge. Through his field glasses, Eli could see riders spreading out to surround the town. "They're here," he whispered to Marshal Briggs, who was disguised as a traveling merchant selling leather goods. The plan was to let the gang members enter the town and commit themselves to their criminal act before springing the trap. It was dangerous. Innocent people could be hurt in the crossfire, but it was the only way to ensure that all the gang members were captured. The rustlers rode into town casually, as if they were simply late arrivals to the festival. They spread out among the crowds, and for a few minutes everything seemed normal. Then one of them made the mistake of trying to steal from a merchant's cash box, and the trap was sprung. "Federal marshals," Briggs shouted, drawing his weapon. "You're all under arrest." The gang members reacted with the speed of professional criminals, scattering in different directions and drawing their guns as they sought cover among the festival booths and buildings. Panicked civilians ran for safety as gunfire erupted in the town square. Deputy reacted instantly, moving to protect a group of children who had been caught in the open when the shooting started. The dog herded them toward the safety of the church, placing himself between the children and the gunman. With the instinctive courage that had made him a legend in Dry Creek, Eli found himself in a running gunfight with 2 of the gang members who had taken cover behind the bandstand. Their position gave them a clear field of fire across the town square, making it impossible for civilians to reach safety. "Deputy, get those people to cover!" Eli called out, and the dog immediately understood. While Eli provided suppressing fire, Deputy ran into the open square and began herding panicked festival-goers toward the safety of nearby buildings. One of the gang members took aim at the dog, recognizing that the animal was hampering their ability to control the situation. But before he could fire, Martha's rifle spoke from the second floor of the general store, and the rustler spun and fell. "Nobody shoots our deputy," she called out, working the lever action to chamber another round. The battle raged for nearly an hour, with gunfire echoing off the buildings and smoke filling the streets. The gang members were professional killers, but they were outnumbered and outgunned by the combined forces of the marshals and the aroused townspeople of Dry Creek. One by one, the rustlers were either killed or forced to surrender. The last 2 made a desperate attempt to escape on horseback, racing toward the canyon country where they hoped to lose pursuit. But Deputy had anticipated their move, positioning himself to cut off their escape route. The dog's presence spooked one of the horses, causing it to rear and throw its rider. The second rustler made it past, but Eli was ready with a rifle shot that brought him down 50 yards from town. As the smoke cleared and the last echoes of gunfire faded, Eli surveyed the damage. Several buildings had bullet holes, and a few people had minor injuries from flying splinters and ricochets, but miraculously, no innocent civilians had been seriously hurt. "Your dog saved a lot of lives today," Marshal Briggs said, reloading his revolver. "I've never seen anything like the way he moved those people to safety, Doc." Henley was busy treating the wounded, both gang members and townspeople, while Martha organized the women to help with first aid and cleanup. The festival had been interrupted, but it hadn't been destroyed. As evening fell, the townspeople gathered in the square again, this time to assess what had happened and what it meant for their future. The cattle-rustling operation that had terrorized the territory for months was finally broken, its members either dead or in custody. "I want to say something about courage," Eli addressed the crowd, with Deputy sitting proudly at his side, his badge gleaming in the torchlight. "Today, we saw a lot of it, and not just from the people wearing badges. We saw it from shopkeepers and farmers, from mothers protecting their children, from a blacksmith who made a badge for a dog because he believed that loyalty deserved recognition." The crowd murmured approval, and several people reached out to Pat Deputy, who accepted the attention with the dignity of a true public servant. "Most of all," Eli continued, "we saw it from a four-legged deputy who risked his life time and again to protect people he'd only known for a few weeks. That kind of loyalty, that kind of courage, that's what makes a community strong." Judge Hamilton stepped forward, holding a blue ribbon that had been intended for the best livestock at the festival. "I think this belongs to our deputy," he said, tying the ribbon to Deputy's collar below his badge. The crowd cheered, and Deputy's tail wagged with what could only be described as pride. The festival ribbon would become as much a part of his identity as the badge itself, a symbol of the community's acceptance and love. As the evening wound down and people began preparing for the final day of the festival, Eli reflected on how much had changed since he'd first arrived in Dry Creek. He'd come as a solitary lawman, carrying the burden of his father's legacy, and he'd found a family, a community, and a partner whose loyalty had proven stronger than any human bond he'd ever experienced. "What do you think, Deputy?" he asked the dog as they walked their evening patrol around the quiet town. "Ready for whatever comes next?" Deputy looked up at him with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to say, "As long as we're together, I'm ready for anything." The hand-carved wooden cross in Eli's pocket seemed to warm at his touch, and he could almost hear his father's voice on the evening breeze. "You've done well, son. You've honored the badge and found something even more valuable. You've found home." The third and final day of the Harvest Festival dawned clear and bright, with no hint of the violence that had erupted the day before. The townspeople had worked through the night to clean up the damage and restore the celebration to its proper spirit. Children who had been frightened by the gunfight were coaxed back into the streets by the promise of candy and games. While their parents kept watchful eyes on the horizon, Eli stood on the porch of his office, his father's Colt revolver holstered at his side and Deputy sitting alertly beside him. The dog's new badge caught the morning sunlight, and the blue festival ribbon fluttered gently in the breeze. Together, they had become a symbol of law and order that reached far beyond the borders of their small town. Sheriff Barnes. The call came from young Tommy Johnson, who was running down Main Street with obvious excitement. "Sheriff, you need to see this." Eli and Deputy walked out to meet the young rancher, who was pointing toward the eastern approach to town. A large group of riders was approaching, at least 20 men on horseback, riding in formation with military precision. Federal marshals. Eli asked, shading his eyes against the sun. "No, sir," Tommy replied. "These look like ranchers and cowboys, and they're carrying something. Looks like a banner or a flag." As the riders drew closer, Eli could see that Tommy was right. The group consisted of ranchers, cowboys, and townspeople from across the territory, and they were indeed carrying a banner that read, "Thank you, Dry Creek," from the grateful citizens of New Mexico Territory. At the head of the procession rode a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, wearing a black suit and a silver badge that identified him as a territorial judge. Behind him came ranchers whose cattle had been stolen and recovered, families whose loved ones had been threatened by the rustling gang, and ordinary citizens who had heard about the courage shown by a small frontier town. Deputy's tail began wagging as he recognized some of the approaching horses and riders. Among them were members of the search party that had helped rescue Eli from the sawmill, now returning as part of this larger delegation. "Sheriff Barnes," the lead rider called out as the procession came to a halt in front of the sheriff's office. "I'm Judge William Morrison, Territorial Circuit Court. We've come to express the gratitude of every law-abiding citizen in New Mexico Territory." The judge dismounted and approached Eli with formal dignity, but his eyes were warm with genuine appreciation. "What you and your people accomplished here has already become legend throughout the territory. You've broken a criminal organization that has terrorized honest folks for far too long." "We just did our jobs, Your Honor," Eli replied. "And we had help, more help than any of us deserved." "Indeed you did." Judge Morrison reached into his saddlebag and pulled out an official-looking document sealed with red wax. "This is a commendation from the territorial governor, recognizing the heroism displayed by the citizens of Dry Creek in general, and by you and your deputy in particular." He handed the document to Eli, then knelt down to Deputy's level. "And this is for you, Deputy." From another bag, he produced a collar made of the finest leather, with silver studs and an engraved nameplate that read, "Deputy, Hero of Dry Creek." Deputy sat perfectly still while the judge replaced his simple collar with the ornate new one. The transformation was remarkable. The battle-scarred stray had become an official representative of law and order, honored by the highest authorities in the territory. "There's more," Judge Morrison said, standing and addressing the crowd that had gathered to witness this unexpected ceremony. "The territorial government has established a reward fund for information leading to the capture of criminal gangs. Half of that fund, $5,000, is being awarded to the town of Dry Creek for exceptional service to the territory." The announcement drew cheers from the townspeople, who had never imagined that their small community could receive such recognition. Mayor Caldwell looked as if he might faint from the shock of such good fortune. "But the real reason we're here," Judge Morrison continued, "is to witness something that I'm told has never happened before in the history of American law enforcement." He pulled out another official document, this one bearing the seal of the territorial legislature. "By special act of the territorial government, and in recognition of extraordinary service above and beyond the call of duty, this German shepherd known as Deputy is hereby granted full legal status as a law enforcement officer of New Mexico Territory, with all the rights and privileges thereof." The crowd fell silent as the implications of the announcement sank in. Deputy wasn't just a mascot or a symbolic figure. He was now legally recognized as a peace officer, the first non-human to receive such status in American history. Eli looked down at his partner, who seemed to understand that something important was happening. The dog's intelligent eyes met his, and in that moment Eli saw not just an animal, but a true partner in the eternal struggle between justice and lawlessness. "Well, Deputy," Eli said, scratching behind the dog's ears, "looks like you're official now. No more questions about whether you belong here." Deputy's response was to stand up and walk to his usual position beside Eli, his new collar gleaming in the sunlight and his festival ribbon fluttering in the breeze. The crowd erupted in cheers, and even the visiting ranchers and officials joined in the celebration. But beneath the joy and recognition, Eli sensed that something even more significant was happening. Word of Deputy's heroism was spreading throughout the territory, inspiring other communities to stand up against the forces of lawlessness and chaos. The courage of one dog was becoming a symbol of hope, for everyone who believed in the possibility of a better, safer world. The afternoon brought the final ceremony of the festival, one that would be remembered long after the temporary booths were taken down and the visiting dignitaries returned to their homes. The entire population of Dry Creek, along with hundreds of visitors, gathered in the town square to witness something unprecedented in the history of the American frontier. Judge Morrison had set up a makeshift courtroom using the bandstand as his bench, complete with an American flag and the territorial seal. Before him stood Eli and Deputy, both wearing their badges of office and representing the triumph of law over lawlessness. "Citizens of New Mexico Territory," Judge Morrison began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "We gather today not just to celebrate the end of a criminal enterprise, but to recognize the extraordinary bond between a lawman and his partner that has redefined what courage and loyalty mean on the American frontier." Deputy sat at attention beside Eli, his intelligent eyes scanning the crowd with the alertness that had made him such an effective law enforcement officer. Children in the front rows pointed at him and whispered excitedly, while adults nodded with the respect due to a proven hero. "Sheriff Barnes," the judge continued, "would you please tell us how this remarkable partnership began?" Eli stepped forward, his hand resting gently on Deputy's head. "Your Honor, it began with a dog who had every reason to distrust humans, but chose to help one anyway. When I was captured and left for dead in that sawmill, this animal stayed with me for 3 days, then led a rescue party to my location through 20 miles of desert. That kind of loyalty can't be trained or commanded. It comes from something deeper." The crowd murmured its appreciation, and several people wiped away tears as they remembered the tension and fear of those days when their sheriff was missing. "And Deputy," Judge Morrison said, addressing the dog directly, "what do you say to that?" Deputy looked up at the judge, then at Eli, and then did something that brought laughter and applause from the entire crowd. He barked once, sharp and clear, as if giving his official testimony to the proceedings. "I think that means he agrees," Judge Morrison said with a smile. "Now, Sheriff Barnes, I understand you have something you'd like to say about the partnership you and Deputy have formed." Eli had been thinking about this moment for days, trying to find words that could express what the dog's friendship and courage had meant to him and to the community. "Your Honor, when I came to Dry Creek 8 months ago, I thought I was here to do a job, to keep the peace and uphold the law. What I found instead was something much more valuable. I found a community that was willing to stand together against evil, and I found a partner whose courage and loyalty humbled me every day." He paused, looking out at the faces of the people who had become his family. "Deputy didn't just save my life. He saved this entire community by showing us what it means to care more about others than about yourself. That's a lesson worth learning, whether you're wearing a badge or just trying to be a good neighbor." Judge Morrison nodded solemnly. "In recognition of that lesson, and in honor of the service you both have provided to the citizens of this territory, I hereby proclaim this day to be Deputy Day throughout New Mexico Territory, to be celebrated annually as a reminder of the courage and loyalty that make civilization possible." The proclamation brought thunderous applause, and Deputy's tail wagged with what could only be described as pride. Someone in the crowd had prepared a special treat, a large bone wrapped with a blue ribbon, which was presented to the canine deputy, with all the ceremony due to a distinguished public servant. As the formal proceedings concluded and the crowd began to disperse, families approached Eli and Deputy to offer their personal thanks. Children who had been terrified during the gunfight now wanted to pet the brave dog who had protected them, while their parents expressed gratitude that probably couldn't be adequately put into words. "Sheriff," said Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow whose late husband had been killed in an Indian raid years earlier, "I want you to know that for the first time since my Henry died, I feel safe in my own home. That's because of you and that wonderful dog." Similar sentiments were expressed by dozens of other townspeople and visitors, each offering their own version of thanks for the peace of mind that Eli and Deputy had restored to their lives. As evening approached and the festival began winding down, Eli found himself standing once again on the porch of his office, watching the sun set over the now peaceful town. Deputy sat beside him, his new collar reflecting the golden light and his festival ribbon stirring gently in the evening breeze. "You know," Eli said to his four-legged partner, "I think we make a pretty good team." Deputy looked up at him with eyes that seemed almost human in their understanding, then rested his head against Eli's leg in a gesture of contentment and trust. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the festival continuing, music and laughter, children playing, adults sharing stories of the day's events. It was the sound of a community that had found its strength and its heart, led by the example of an unlikely partnership between a lonely sheriff and a stray dog who had chosen to trust again. The badge on Deputy's collar caught the last rays of sunlight, and in that gleaming metal, Eli could see the reflection of everything they had accomplished together, not just the capture of criminals or the restoration of peace, but the creation of something that would endure long after both of them were gone. The knowledge that courage and loyalty could triumph over any form of evil, no matter how powerful or well-organized. 1 month after the Harvest Festival, life in Dry Creek had settled into a rhythm that would have been impossible to imagine just a few weeks earlier. The cattle rustling that had terrorized the territory for months was now just a memory, and the town had become a symbol of what frontier communities could accomplish when they stood together against lawlessness. Eli sat on the porch of his office in the early morning light, reading a letter that had arrived on the previous day's mail coach. Deputy lay beside him, his ornate collar gleaming and his blue festival ribbon now permanently attached as a symbol of his service to the community. The letter was from Marshal Briggs, who had returned to his headquarters in Santa Fe to file his final report on the Mullins gang investigation. "Sheriff Barnes," the letter read, "I wanted you to know that your actions in this case have been noted at the highest levels of territorial law enforcement. There's talk of offering you a position as a federal marshal if you're interested in taking on a larger area of responsibility." Eli folded the letter and looked out at the town that had become his home. The offer was flattering, and the pay would certainly be better than what Dry Creek could afford to pay its sheriff. But as he watched Deputy's ears prick up at the sound of children walking to school, he realized that some opportunities were worth more than money or prestige. "What do you think, partner?" he asked the dog. "Should we consider moving on to bigger things?" Deputy's response was to stand up and walk to the edge of the porch, where he could see the entire length of Main Street. His posture was alert and protective, that of a guardian watching over his territory and his people. The message was clear. This was where they belonged. Doc Henley emerged from his clinic across the street, his medical bag in hand as he prepared for his morning rounds. At 68, he moved a little slower than he once had, but his dedication to the health and welfare of Dry Creek citizens remained unwavering. "Morning, Sheriff," he called out. "How's our deputy doing today?" "Same as always, Doc, ready for whatever the day might bring." Doc approached the porch and settled onto the wooden steps with a contented sigh. "You know, I've been thinking about what happened here over the past few weeks. 20 years from now, when people tell the story of how Dry Creek defeated the Mullins gang, they're going to focus on the gunfights and the dramatic rescues." "Probably," Eli agreed, "but that's not really what this was about, was it? It was about a community finding its courage, and about a man and a dog showing everyone what loyalty and partnership can accomplish." Eli scratched behind Deputy's ears, feeling the warmth of the morning sun and the satisfaction of a job well done. Sometimes the most important battles aren't the ones that make the newspapers. As if summoned by their conversation, Martha appeared from the direction of her saloon, and carrying a tray with 3 cups of coffee and what appeared to be a large soup bone wrapped in brown paper. "Thought you boys might be ready for some breakfast," she said, settling the tray on the porch railing. "And I brought something special for our deputy." Deputy accepted the bone with the dignity that had become his trademark, though his tail wagged with genuine appreciation. Martha had taken to spoiling the dog with special treats, claiming that heroes deserved special consideration. "Martha," Eli said, "I got a letter from Marshal Briggs yesterday. There's talk of offering me a federal position." Martha's expression grew serious. "What did you tell him?" "Haven't responded yet. Still thinking it over." "Well, you think all you want," Martha said firmly, "but you should know that this town needs you. Both of you. You've given us something we never had before. The confidence that good people can stand up to evil and win." Mayor Caldwell's carriage rounded the corner, dust swirling behind the wheels as it approached the sheriff's office. The mayor had been in an unusually good mood since the $5,000 reward had been deposited in the town's account, and he'd been talking about improvements that would make Dry Creek more attractive to new settlers. "Sheriff Barnes," he called out, not bothering to wait until his carriage stopped. "Wonderful news. We've had 3 new families arrive this week, all wanting to settle here because they heard about our safe and peaceful community." "That's good to hear, Mayor," Eli replied. "Indeed it is. And I have a proposal for you." Mayor Caldwell climbed down from his carriage with obvious excitement. "The town council has voted to offer you a substantial raise in salary, plus a new house with a proper yard for Deputy. We want you to know how much we value your service." Eli looked at Deputy, who was contentedly working on his soup bone, then at the faces of Doc Henley and Martha, who had become as much family to him as anyone he'd ever known. "Mayor, I appreciate the offer, but I think Deputy and I are happy with things just the way they are." The relief on Mayor Caldwell's face was obvious. "Excellent!" "Excellent. I'll inform the council immediately." As the mayor drove away to spread the news, Eli reflected on how much his life had changed since that morning, when he'd first seen a battle-scarred German shepherd watching the town from a distance. He'd come to Dry Creek as a solitary lawman, carrying the burden of his father's legacy, and he'd found something far more valuable than professional success. He'd found home. The blacksmith, Jim Morrison, approached the office carrying something wrapped in canvas. "Sheriff, I finished that project you asked me about." He unwrapped the canvas to reveal an engraved wooden sign that read, "Dry Creek Sheriff's Office, Sheriff Eli Barnes and Deputy." Below the text was a carefully carved image of a man and a dog standing side by side. "Where would you like me to mount it?" Morrison asked. "Right here above the door," Eli replied. "Where everyone can see it." As Morrison worked to install the sign, Deputy moved to his favorite spot in the shade and settled down for his morning nap. The dog's collar gleamed in the dappled sunlight, and his blue festival ribbon stirred gently in the breeze, a permanent reminder of the day when an entire territory had recognized the extraordinary bond between a lawman and his partner. Eli pulled out the hand-carved wooden cross that his father had made so many years ago, feeling its smooth surface and remembering the man who had taught him that. Courage and justice were not just professional obligations but personal callings. "I think you'd be proud of what we've accomplished here, Dad," he said quietly. "We've built something that will last long after we're gone, a community that knows the difference between right and wrong and isn't afraid to act on that knowledge." As the afternoon wore on and the town settled into its peaceful routine, children began gathering around the sheriff's office, as they did every day after school. They came to see Deputy, to hear stories about his adventures, and to learn the lessons that his courage and loyalty could teach. "Tell us again about how Deputy led the rescue party to the sawmill," one of the children requested. Eli settled into his chair on the porch, with Deputy moving to sit beside him in the position that had become their trademark pose. "Well," he began, "it all started with a dog who had every reason to give up on people, but chose to trust one more time." As he told the story once again, Eli looked out at the thriving town that surrounded them. New families were arriving weekly, drawn by the reputation for safety and community that Dry Creek had earned. The cattle ranches were prospering again, no longer threatened by rustlers and thieves. Most importantly, the people had learned that they could depend on each other in times of crisis. The engraved collar with its deputy badge caught the afternoon light. And Eli smiled as he remembered that first day when a stray dog had appeared on Main Street, carrying a sheriff's star in its mouth. That moment had changed everything, not just for him and Deputy, but for an entire community that had learned to believe in the power of loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bonds that could form between the most unlikely partners. As the sun set over Dry Creek, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Eli Barnes and his deputy began their evening patrol. They walked together down Main Street, past the general store and the saloon, past the church and the schoolhouse, past all the places where ordinary people lived their lives in safety and peace. And if you had asked any citizen of Dry Creek what made their town special, they would have told you about a sheriff and his dog who had proven that sometimes the most broken souls find each other when hope seems lost forever, and that together they can accomplish miracles that neither could achieve alone.